My name's Caton, and it is my fantastically great pleasure to be your host for the Brighton Pride Soapbox. It's an inaugural collection of talks and lectures, which we hope are going to become as much a fixture of Brighton Pride as marching and partying in Preston Park. This is a collection of talks that highlight the activism, protest and politics that are and should be a fundamental part of the modern Pride movement. The theme of this year's talks is changing our LGBTQ+ futures with passion. So no one finer to speak on this subject than today's speaker, who is the seemingly tireless and fearless, I'd observe as well, human rights activist, Peter Tatchell. Now we're going to be hearing from Peter shortly, but some brief housekeeping first. If you're watching on Zoom, thank you for joining us, welcome. Do please stay on mute while Peter is speaking, but if you've got any questions or comments as Peter's talking, do please just pop those into the chat box and I'll put those to Peter later on in the Q&A. And for those watching via the Gscene Facebook page, again, welcome, thank you so much for joining us. And once again, do post any questions or comments up on the Facebook page. And again, I'll collect those and put those to Peter. Peter's an absolute hero of mine, so it gives me incredible pleasure to say, with no further ado, talking on queer liberation, why LGBTQ+ equality is not enough, I give you Peter Tatchell.
Thank you so much. I'm very honoured to join you. I guess my starting point is that equality is now the mantra of the UK and indeed global LGBT+ movement. So the idea that equality is not enough is very controversial and challenging. But I've got to say that although equality has much to recommend it, I don't feel comfortable with the way most of our community has lowered its aspirations to the limited goal of equal rights. They are important, of course, but my argument is they are not enough. I ask the question, whatever happened to the lofty ideals of queer liberation and sexual freedom? Where did they go? I think we have too often moved away from defining our needs on our terms and instead fallen rather meekly into the prevailing heterosexual consensus. So look at same-sex marriage. Of course, winning marriage equality was tremendously important, and I was spearheading that campaign from way back in 1992. So I agree that homophobic discrimination against same-sex couples is wrong, that it had to be challenged and defeated because it was a form of anti-LGBT+ discrimination. But then I would ask the question is, do we really think that the model of marriage is the best method or the best framework for acknowledging and recognizing relationships, whether they be opposite sex or same sex? My argument would be that if we were just starting from scratch, I don't think the marriage model would be the one that we would adopt. It is too dogmatic and inflexible. It is one size fits all. So regardless of different diverse relationships and lifestyles, the marriage model and its younger sibling civil partnerships, which are essentially marriage light, they are based upon a long historic tradition of the way in which the law recognizes relationships. But my argument is, I think we need a more democratic, egalitarian alternative. And I've written about this in detail. I won't go into the particulars right now, but I do think that the way in which we just conceded the argument that marriage is the gold standard, that it is the be-all and end-all, the acme, the paramount version of relationship recognition, I think shows a lack of imagination and indeed a bowing down before a model of relationship recognition and rights that was devised by straight people, not by us. We can perhaps come back to that during the Q&A. The end result of merely accepting equality is that the dominant agenda is about equal rights and law reform rather than transforming society. So we don't question what is, we simply want equality within the status quo. And this is very much an agenda about conformism and assimilation. It doesn't suggest or acknowledge that we queers, out of our history and experience, may have better ideas, may have alternatives that we could produce instead of what exists. And I think that this political retreat represents a massive loss of imagination, confidence, and vision. I want to repeat that equality is important, but my argument is it's not sufficient. It's not the panacea that many people claim. Now, equality for LGBT plus people inevitably means parity on straight terms within a pre-existing framework of values, laws, and institutions. These have been devised by and for the straight majority, not by us. Equality within their system involves conformity to their rules. And I think this is a recipe for submission and incorporation, not genuine queer liberation. So to give another example, we often hear the cry that we want LGBT plus inclusive relationship and sex education in schools. And of course we do, but we don't want the current existing framework, which is inadequate, whether the pupils are gay, straight, bisexual, trans, non-binary, or whatever. You know, the current framework for relationship and sex education in schools is not good enough for anyone. So merely seeking equality within that system as it exists is not good enough. We're letting down not only LGBT plus pupils, but also we're letting down straight pupils as well. So I want to say that although getting rid of homophobic discrimination is a very laudable aim, which I support, it doesn't go far enough. Ending anti-LGBT plus bias will not resolve all the problems faced by queer people. Some of our difficulties arise not simply from homophobia, biphobia, or transphobia, but also from the more general erotophobic and sex negative nature of contemporary culture. And that also harms straight and cisgender people as well. So you can see this in the way in which puritanical, sex negative attitudes are evident in the censorship of sexual imagery, in the inadequacy of sex education lessons, as I've just mentioned, in the criminalization of sex workers, in the outlawing of consensual sadomasochistic relationships, and of course, in the criminalization of teenagers of similar ages who have sex with each other before the lawful age of consent of 16. In all those different ways, we can see that the anti-sex culture, which is still quite deeply ingrained in our society, not as bad as it was 50 years ago for sure, but it's still there and still has a negative impact. And I want to emphasize again that the drawbacks associated with seeking mere equality are not limited to our community. They also apply to women who are usually forced to compete on male terms to get ahead in the workplace. They also apply to Black people, who tend to only succeed if they adopt a white middle-class lifestyle and assimilate into the dominant European culture. As both women and ethnic minorities have discovered to their cost, the equal rights agenda is not about respecting difference and validating it. It's mostly about obliterating it. So where is the dignity in that? How can we have self-respect if we sacrifice our queer identity and our queer culture for the sake of parity? It is acceptance, that is true, but acceptance at a price that I would say is not worth paying. Moreover, equal rights does not equate with genuine freedom. So again, for example, despite formal legal equality between the sexes in Britain for decades, women's earnings are still only about 4/5 of men. Only about 4/5 of men. And of course, likewise, over 50 years after the end of racially discriminatory statutes in the United States, informal segregation affecting Black communities persists. It's not enforced by segregation like it once was, but there's an informal segregation based often on economic inequality, where Black and white communities often live very separate lives. And of course, as the Black Lives Matter movement has shown, police brutality and murders are still commonplace, just like they were in the 1950s and 60s. And poor Black people in America are still locked out of economic success. So I guess these lessons are lessons that we queers have to take on board. We ignore them at our peril. The same fate will befall us if we jump on the limited agenda of equality. We will end up with equal rights, that is true, and that will be an advance, but within a fundamentally flawed, unjust society, where for us, the rules are skewed against sexual choice and self-determination. The rules are skewed against our own unique insights, experiences, and lifestyle relationship models. Equality for queers is a political deal that leads to social assimilation. We assimilate into, we accommodate to, we fit in with society as it is. And that implies that we ourselves are pretty much worthless, that we have nothing to give society. It's society has to give to us the gift of equal rights. So if we go down that road, of course, a condition of equal treatment is that LGBT plus people are expected to conform to the straight system, to its norms and aspirations. And so, one thing we've seen very much in our community in recent years is the increased importance and significance of same-sex parenting. Now, again, I've championed that cause and will fight to my death to stop people who want to have children being denied it because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. But I think also we need to ask, why is it that so many people think, or in our community think, that without having children, they are somehow incomplete? Now, I accept that for some people, there's a really strong urge to have children, and I will defend their right and support them. But I just question about the vogue for having kids in our community. Again, it has a whiff that we are just so desperate to fit in with the straight model of family life, which may have its virtues and its value, but I think we also need to be critical and skeptical. I think we are witnessing the increasing co-option and invisibilization of LGBT plus people. You know, you can say we are more everywhere than ever before on TV and in public life. That's true. But we are there as facsimiles of straight people and their values, lifestyles, and aspirations. So the end result is that we get equality, but the price we pay is the surrender of our own unique, distinctive queerness. The insights and ethics that have forged our response to being excluded and discriminated against by a hostile straight world. Out of this suffering, we have developed worthwhile understandings, insights, experiences, and other ways of living which straight people could learn from. And I think we need to hold on to that. I think we also need to acknowledge that the unwritten, unspoken social contract at the heart of LGBT plus equality and law reform is that we queers will behave respectably, that we will be the good model citizens that straight society expects, that we will comply with the heterosexual moral agenda. So no more cruising, no more orgies, no more sex clubs, no more sadomasochism. And even if none of that is the thing that you love or the thing that turns you on, I think we need to defend the right of others who do. In return, I suppose the contract is that the good gays get equal treatment. Meanwhile, all the, well, perhaps not all, but at least some of the sex repressive social structures, laws, values, institutions remain intact, and the bad guys remain sexual outlaws. This kind of LGBT plus reformism involves an abandonment of any critical perspective on straight culture. You know, we don't distinguish between the good aspects and the bad aspects. You know, we don't make an assessment about what is worthy of queer emulation and what is not. So in place of a healthy skepticism, which I think is a great public virtue, in place of a healthy skepticism towards the heterosexual consensus, we're substituting a naive acquiescence. Discernment is abandoned in favor of compliance. We trade our souls for the gift of equal rights. The truth is that increasingly today, most advocates of LGBT plus equality never question the status quo. They take it for granted. They assume that is where it is. They are straight minds trapped in queer bodies. Accepting society as it is, these hetero homos want nothing more than their cozy place in the queer sun, in the straight sun. Most are all too willing to mimic heterosexual norms and values. And as I said, we discard or put to one side the attempt to distinguish between those elements of straight culture that it is good to follow and emulate, and those that are not. All that matters is parity. Now, this may be equality, and it certainly would be progress, but it's not liberation. I want to go back to the point that I made about what we can bring straight people and culture. We should never forget that gay, bisexual, and trans men have shown straight and cisgender men a new way of being a man. You know, we don't, in general, normally conform to the machismo and the macho style the toxic masculinity that has historically been associated with heterosexual maleness. We have evolved a new way of being a man, which goes beyond merely not having sex with a person of the opposite sex. As a general rule, of course, there are exceptions. I would say that gay and bisexual men tend to be more in tune with their emotions and feelings. They're less uptight, less cold, more emotional. And of course, there are gay men and bisexual men who are very macho and ultra masculine and even toxic. But they're, I think, the exception. And this departure from straight norms or expectations or behaviors or feelings is one of the reasons why gay and bisexual men are disproportionately represented in the creative, artistic, and caring professions. In those professions, you have to be in touch with your feelings to do your job well, to be successful. Conversely, if we look at lesbian, bisexual, and trans women, again, they have shown a different new way of being a woman. They've challenged the orthodoxy, the feminine stereotype, the way in which women are expected to behave, which again goes beyond the mere fact that they don't sexually relate to men. It's about a much bigger psychological, emotional mindset. Again, we don't want to stereotype and overgeneralize, but I would say that these women tend to be more independent, less dependent on men, often more assertive. And that is why lesbian and bisexual women, again, have been disproportionately represented in battles for women's equality. Look at the disproportionate number of lesbians and bisexual women involved in the suffragette movement, or more recently in the 1970s in the battle to open up all male occupations to women. I had lots of lesbian friends who were involved in the campaign for women in manual trades, so that women could get apprentices to learn to be plumbers, electricians, carpenters, and bricklayers. Looking around at that campaign, a very high proportion of those women, far more than the proportion of lesbian and bi women in the population, they were lesbian and bisexual women. They pioneered women's advancement, which paved the way for straight and cisgender women to follow. So again, what I'm trying to say is we as a community have so much to give. We shouldn't undervalue ourselves, our own achievements, our insights, the fact that we can teach straight and cisgender people a lot of positive things. So it isn't just about equal rights. It isn't just about fitting in with their system. It's about changing their system. And I'm so proud that so many of our members of our community have, through the ages, been pioneers for social reform and change, not just on issues of sexuality and gender identity, but on issues of women's rights, Black rights, and many other struggles for social reform. So that's why I say today that queer liberation is important, that talking about transforming society is something we must get back to. Equality alone is not enough. We need to have broader, bolder horizons and think about what could be rather than accept what is. Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much. Now, just to remind people who are watching on Facebook via the Gscene page, feel free to add to the comments if you've got any questions or comments to put to Peter, and to remind you that this is one of the Brighton Pride soapbox lectures, talks with Peter Tatchell, of course. Peter, absolutely tons of stuff to dig into here. I want to ask you about one of the things you were saying right at the beginning of about the what you identify as a lack of ambition within LGBTQ, about wanting to change society, about wanting to see and identify something different. Why do you think? What are your theories about why you think that is?
Perhaps let me start by going back 50 years ago. This year, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Gay Liberation Front in Britain. It was a pioneering, trailblazing movement, and I was part of it. The word equality, I don't think, ever passed our lips, because we had an agenda about changing society, not fitting in with what existed. And also, we allied with other social movements similarly seeking social change, with the women's liberation movement, the Black rights movement, and the struggles of working class people and trade unions. We felt that we had a common interest in working together to try and build a better society. And so our agenda was very much about imagining what an ideal future might be like. Now, I agree that it is much easier to seek to reform things within the status quo rather than seeking to transform society. It's a much bigger challenge to try and change the way society operates, its values, laws, and institutions, than simply getting reforms within the system. And I think the initial difficulty in getting those transformative changes in the 1970s led many people to, perhaps even reluctantly, fall back to the more narrow terrain of equal rights. It seemed an easier thing to do. But on the other hand, if you think about it, of course, transforming society may take longer. But if you never make the argument for that transformation, if you simply make the argument for equality, of course, that's all you'll get. And that, I think, has been the big failing. I mean, I was also involved in Outrage in the 1990s. And Outrage sought to balance both the struggle for equality with the vision of a broader transformation. So we did pioneer the battle for same-sex marriage in 1992, when we got 4 couples who were members of our organization to file applications for civil marriage at Westminster Register Office. Of course, they were refused. But that was the opening shot in the battle, the long battle to get marriage equality. But at the same time, we argued for an alternative framework, what we at the time called an Unmarried Partners Act. And this would allow anybody to nominate any significant other person in their life as their next of kin and beneficiary in terms of inheritance. And that, of course, could be a partner, but in the case of single people who are discriminated against in law, it could also be a favorite niece or nephew, a lifelong best friend. And then when it came to people in love-type romantic relationships, we argued that they should be able to pick and choose from a menu of rights and responsibilities to create a tailor-made partnership agreement suited to their particular circumstances, which is very different from the one-size-fits-all model of marriage and civil partnerships. So we were saying, look, in modern society, whatever your sexuality or gender identity, there are lots of different models of relationships and lifestyles. Some partners live together, some live apart. Some share their finances, others maintain financial independence. Some have children, others don't. Let's create a system that the couples concerned can devise off their own backs, where they can create a partnership agreement that is bespoke, tailor-made to their particular circumstances. That struck us as being much more democratic, egalitarian, and flexible, and much more suited to the huge variety of modern lifestyles and relationships. So you can see how Outrage was trying to balance the two, equality on the one hand, but this alternative as another. And I've got to say that I was very proud to know that in the Australian state of Tasmania, they adopted a system of partnership recognition very similar to our Unmarried Partners Act. Not exactly the same, but quite similar. And it had huge public support, not just amongst the LGBT plus community, but in straight society as well, because even lots of straight people recognize that marriage was a very, rigid, inflexible system.
Absolutely. But a comment to put to you from somebody joining us on Zoom, saying, as an example of queer institutions having something to offer, look at recent research into benefits of polyamory, around half of whom in the US are bi, compared with the straight institution of swinging, which doesn't acknowledge or seeks to control the emotional aspect of non-monogamy.
Yeah, I think the whole issue of polyamorous relationships needs to be addressed because it is a fact of life. And I have 3 male friends who've been in a 3-way partnership for almost 30 years. It works for them. Of course, it won't work for everyone, not to everyone's taste. But I think people who have that desire and have a love and commitment to more than 2 other people, they do deserve recognition as well. And I think, as the person who asked the question has indicated, people in our community have tended to pioneer that model of relationship as well.
I want to ask you your thoughts as well about ideas of divisions within and under the LGBTQ plus umbrella. There are some quite strong opinions coming from somebody who's watching on Zoom regarding comments about male and female sexualities, and they're of the opinion that they're very separate and different. For example, she says lesbians never had the obsession with cruising, orgies or S&M. Would say that's some lesbians may or may not. I think we have to personally. I think we have to be very careful about not speaking for all people. I want to ask you kind of how we are under this glorious and ever-growing LGBTQ plus umbrella, but it also feels very much that there are rifts within that. There have been some very ferocious and quite cruel public debates over trans rights and trans denial going on, and I want to ask you your thoughts, really.
Well, I think a very good liberal principle is live and let live. If someone isn't harming anybody else, I think we should let people live the lives they want to live. When it comes to the trans issue in particular, I can remember way back in, 50 years ago, almost, I and others in the Gay Liberation Front were championing trans rights. And indeed, when several trans women were refused service at a cafe in Piccadilly Circus, we went there in protest to support them and to demand that they be served. And we did a whole sort of sit-in in the cafe. And as a result, the cafe rescinded its policy and agreed to serve trans women. So, it may have been somewhat of a minority concern within sections of the LGBT community in recent years, or until recent years, but there is a radical gay liberationist tradition which has supported and embraced trans men and women from the get-go. And the reason we do that is because many people have often said, well, what have trans people got to do with lesbian, gay, and bisexual people? That's an entirely different issue. But I don't see it that way, because trans people and LGBT people or we're all gender non-conformists. We don't fit the way in which we are expected to behave by society. In the case of gay and bisexual men, we don't have sex with women. In the case of lesbian and bisexual women, we don't have sex with men. In the case of trans people, we don't fit this rigid binary of male and female, or they don't fit this rigid binary of male and female. And I think that to acknowledge the diversity of our community is so important. It's been a paramount aspect of our battle for basic rights for LGBT people. Why shouldn't we stick with that principle when it comes to trans people as well? They are, as I said, victims of a gender system, a gender regime, which seeks to put people in boxes. And we're not like shoes or clothes. We are people, and we're very diverse. And the more and more science comes out, it shows that there's incredible diversity, not just in human sexuality and gender identity, but also in some respects, in some parts of non-human animals as well. I really regret the incredible toxic atmosphere that has been generated in the debate around trans issues. It doesn't help us. That's not the way we should treat each other. If we want straight people and cisgender people to treat us with respect, we have to act in a way that is respectful. And we can disagree, but I think we should do so civilly. We should protest, but we should protest with research, evidence, and arguments to show the case for trans rights. I think we also need to always remember that trans women and other women are both victims of misogyny. The levels of domestic violence, rape, discrimination, and hate crime are unacceptably high, both for women and trans women. Why fight each other? Why not work together to fight the common enemy? Accepting trans people doesn't take anything away from non-trans women. It doesn't deny their being. It doesn't discriminate against them. I have worked with women in rape crisis centres, in domestic violence units, and women's refuges who've told me that for years they have worked with trans women, with the agreement of their management board and with the agreement of their clients. Not a single one of those organizations has said there's ever been a problem. Now, of course, there have been a handful of highly publicized cases where trans women have done terrible things, committed violence or even rape against other women. And that is totally wrong. But it's also totally wrong to therefore portray all trans women as threats and perpetrators. You cannot demonize a whole community, which is what some, and I emphasize some, not all, women critics of trans rights do. On the basis of what a handful of trans women have done, which has been bad, and I do condemn it, they go out and seem to portray all trans women as a threat. That is simply not true. And no one would ever tolerate, well, apart from extreme far-right fascists, no one would ever tolerate the demonization of the whole Muslim community or all Muslim people on the basis of what a tiny minority of terrorists do. So why should that generalization and demonization be transferred and perpetrated against trans people? It is just so wrong, and it mirrors precisely the demonization that LGBT people ourselves have experienced over history. We have been demonized as sex addicts, perverts, pedophiles, immoral, sinful, whatever. That demonization that we went through must surely make us aware that we must never go down that road again with other members of society, whether they be trans people or Muslims or Jews or Black and Asian people, we've got to stand in solidarity with victims of discrimination. And we know the levels of discrimination, violence, hate crime, and sexual assault against trans people, mainly trans women, but against trans people, is astronomically high, way, way, way and above that for almost every other social group. So that ought to be the basis on which we move forward. Opposing oppression, standing in solidarity with the victims.
And on that solidarity theme, I mean, I'm very struck by what you have hanging behind you in your kitchen about solidarity with Black LGBTQ people. We're in the year where despite everything going on in the world, where the Black Lives Matter movement needs to be really genuinely gathering momentum around the world. How much do you think within the LGBTQ community we are doing enough to challenge ourselves about racist attitudes or biases?
Well, clearly not enough. We need to do more and better. Black and other people of colour in our community tend not to have the high profile that white people do. And that's an issue. We need more LGBT plus Black and people of colour taking leading positions in our community and speaking on behalf of our community, so that we reflect not only the fact that there are Black and people of colour within our community, but also the wider society. We have to set an example. We have to set an example because we have experienced oppression. We know what it's like. So therefore, we have to be particularly sensitive to those within our community who are victims of double or triple oppression on account of their gender, their race, their cultural background, whatever. We really do need to up the ante. And in this whole debate, I want to raise one issue which I don't think is being heard. Black and Asian people have made gains in our community and are better represented than before, although not sufficiently. But East Asian people are still, within that subset, even more underrepresented. I can't think of a single East Asian person who represents or speaks on behalf of an LGBT plus organisation in the UK. I may be wrong, and there may be one or two, but it's very, very rare. And people of East Asian heritage are part of Britain. They're part of our society, and they are part of our LGBT plus community. And so together with people of African and Afro-Caribbean heritage, together with people of Middle East origins, of heritage in Central and Latin America, East Asian people need a better visibility within our communities.
Are there opportunities, do you think, potentially at all, during this kind of transitional COVID, I hope soon to be post-COVID world that we're all going to find ourselves living in? And I asked about opportunities basically in the face of all of the really depressing news pieces yesterday, talking about just how increasingly divided our society is in the UK specifically, and how the difference and the gaps between opportunities are so wide that we're the most divided nation in Europe, statistically speaking. Can there be, and can you see any opportunities as we move through everything COVID shaped to have a different future?
Well, the COVID-19 pandemic and the related economic slowdown and soon to come recession is a great opportunity for us to build back better. Not to return to the old normal, which most people say, according to the polls, they don't want. They want a different kind of society. They want quality of life elevated over quantity of wealth. It is an opportunity for us to have a big, big rethink. And I am hopeful that out of movements like Extinction Rebellion and Black Lives Matter, we will move in that direction. But it is not a certain outcome. It is still very precarious. There are many people who want us to return to business as usual. And that would be a disaster on every front. I just, on a simple level, I just enjoyed quieter skies without airplanes going over every few minutes. I've enjoyed seeing butterflies and bees in my little tiny pocket garden for the first time in years. I've loved the joy of more and more birdsong than I've ever heard for decades. I don't want to go back to the old normal. And in terms of charting the future, I think it's incumbent on our community to work with other communities to forge a different alternative. One of the problems in forging a different alternative is we are stuck with a government that most of the people in this country voted against. And therefore, although a majority of people may want change, we have a government that does not represent us. Boris Johnson won power in 2019 with less than 44% of the vote. But the Conservatives bagged 56% of the seats and 100% of the power. They have no mandate for anything. A majority of people did not want the Conservatives. They wanted a different party. And I think voting reform to ensure that the percentage of votes won by a party is matched by the percentage of seats won by the party is an absolutely pivotal, vital victory to win in order to secure a fairer, more just society. The majority of people in this country are not conservative. They don't want the Conservatives, but the Conservatives have been in power, and before them Labour, based on a minority of votes. In Britain, we have not had a governing party with majority public support since 1931. Every single government since then has been based upon a governing party winning minority support. Even Margaret Thatcher's landslide in 1983 and Tony Blair's landslide in 1997 was based on winning about 43% of the vote. That is not a majority. So it isn't a party political thing, it's about principle. We've got to have a fair voting system and a parliament and government that represents the true views of the British people. And on that basis, I hope that there will be an opportunity to ensure that we have fundamental changes in the way our society is organised, not just in terms of LGBT plus rights, but also in terms of women's rights, the rights of Black and minority ethnic people, and of course, very particularly in terms of economic justice, because class inequality and economic injustice underpins so much of the disadvantage and discrimination that we collectively face.
Shortly before everything closed down, there was the opening of an exhibition at Brighton Museum. There's an archive piece of video with you talking in Preston Park from the back of a truck in the 1990s sometime. When you look back on the battles and issues of then and the battles and issues of now, what lessons can we learn from history, and what makes you think, oh God, here we go again, but just with different subject titles above it?
Well, first let me say, although there are many battles to still fight and win, we have moved mountains. We should always remind us that until 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world, some of them dating back centuries. Yet by 2014, just 15 years later, every single one of those major anti-LGBT plus laws had been repealed. That was a phenomenally successful social law reform campaign. And I've got to pay tribute to the tens of thousands of unsung, unknown LGBT plus people and our straight friends and allies who made that possible. They will never get recognition, but I know that without them, we would not be where we are today. We are now one of the better countries in the world. Not the best, but one of the better countries, whereas we are one of the worst, certainly in terms of European countries just 2 decades ago. So we have made progress. And I think it shows that collective action is the way forward. You know, we can all do individual things, but it's only when the individuals join up together that we become a mighty force for social change. And yes, we're still fighting some battles. You know, formal legal equality has largely been won. You know, a few little things like, you know, the equality laws do give qualified exemptions for religious organizations and faith-run schools, hospitals, and nursing homes. So there are some unequal things still on the statute books. But overall, we have made enormous progress. But I think the real progress now to make is in the cultural sphere. You know, even today, 16% of British people still believe that homosexuality is mostly or always wrong. That is, you know, 1 in 6 of the British population. Now, it's not like it was in the 1980s when it was over 2/3, but it's still 1 in 6. And that's a very sizable minority. And so the importance of coming out and challenging homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia wherever we see it is still so relevant, because we know that someone who knows an out LGBT plus person, someone who's engaged by LGBT plus people about equality issues, is much more likely to support our rights and freedoms, and much less likely to hold prejudices and discriminate.
The theme of this year's Brighton Pride Soapbox Talks is changing our LGBTQ plus futures with passion. What do you think about those for whom who may fit under some of the letters of that acronym, who do not think that there is such a thing as LGBTQ plus?
Well, of course, the number of people who have sex with people of the same sex is much greater than the number who identify as LGBT plus. That's true. But I think it is a matter of time. Now, I've been really gratified to find that the Observer poll, the last one I looked at was, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, in fact, but the Observer poll showed that of young people aged 16 to 24, 23% had had a same-sex experience. Now, not all that 23% will identify as LGBT plus, but the fact that, you know, almost a quarter of all young people have had a same-sex experience and prepared to tell a researcher that fact, that's an enormous advance. Likewise, there was a poll a couple of years ago where 49% of young people in the same demographic, 16 to 24, said they would not identify as 100% heterosexual. That's 1 in 2 of young people. That's an extraordinary change in social values and attitudes among young people. So it shows that things are changing, and that process of change, I think, will accelerate. And I think we will find that we'll never have 100% people identifying as LGBT plus, or even maybe half. But I think, you know, it's quite possible we will have a much higher proportion than currently now. And I think also what is very interesting is that as homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia decline, perhaps these identities will become less important and significant. You know, people won't feel the need to assert either an LGBT plus identity or a straight identity, because it won't matter. No one will care. No one will bother about who you love or have sex with, because we will have reached sort of, I suppose, the borderline of a post-homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic society. And that's what I've always aimed for. You know, a society where you won't need a Peter Tatchell, you won't need Stonewall or My Foundation or other organizations, because our sexuality and gender identity will just become part of the natural spectrum. You won't need gay bars or clubs, nice though they are, because we will be part of the social mix, that our identity will no longer be an issue. And of course, it's always good to remember that LGBT plus identity largely came into existence in response to oppression. We were persecuted because of our sexuality and gender identity. So therefore we had to assert it and defend it. And that's why we developed this identity and these campaigns and movements to defend who we are against those who want to persecute us because of it. Now, if we reach a situation where we're no longer persecuted, will there any longer be a need to assert and defend those identities? Probably not. But that, of course, is quite a long time in the future.
Yes, I think the question in our lifetimes, I'm pretty sure I know what the answer is to that, although it is a good thing to aspire towards. And finally, in terms of how people from the UK can be better allies to our queer siblings around the globe, and useful, meaningful things that we can do, what would you suggest?
Well, I'm a bit of an odd one, because I can remember way back when I began at the age of 17 in 1969, always thinking this wasn't a national struggle, this is a global struggle. We have to fight for the right of LGBT people all over the world, not just in our community, our city or country, but in every country. And I can remember in the Gay Liberation Front, some people used to joke about me, because I was always suggesting, let's have a protest in solidarity with LGBTs here. Let's have a solidarity protest with LGBTs there. I can remember in 1971 organizing a protest outside the Cuban embassy when we learned that the then Cuban governor, Fidel Castro, was casting off LGBT plus people to labor camps to make them straight. This was horrific, and particularly for those of us like me on the left, it was even more horrific that a left-wing government was doing this. And I've always believed that we can't look at this issue in the isolation of our particular country. None of us can be truly free until all of us are truly free. And that's why it's really important that we do amplify and publicize the struggles and voices of LGBT plus people in other countries. And if you follow my Twitter feed or Facebook, you will see that I'm often publicizing stories about heroic LGBT plus defenders in many different countries, to draw attention to their struggle, which is often unreported in the mainstream media, which is not only to inform and educate, but also to give them the sense that the outside world is watching. I've been to Russia 5 times to support the LGBT plus movement there. And the one thing they've always said to me, which really struck me, is the fact that you're here, the fact that you're bringing British journalists and media to cover our attempt to hold pride parades, that's so important, because it shows us that we're not isolated, we're not alone. It isn't just us versus big bad Putin. We've got friends and allies around the world. And when we manage to get news stories on the BBC or in the Guardian or other newspapers, LGBT plus activists in other countries, they get a huge psychological and emotional boost, because they know that people in the outside world know and understand about their suffering and their struggle. And for people who are battling against intense tyranny, where they're often risking their lives and liberty, that's tremendously important. It's one of the things that helps sustain them, to know that people in the outside world know and care. So that's one thing we can do. Also, of course, I've always argued that pride parades in Britain should make a point of twinning with pride parades in countries where there is intense repression, to not only publicize what's happening in countries like Poland, or Zimbabwe or wherever, but also to perhaps give them financial aid from time to time, to do a collection. In some of these countries, they need photocopiers, they need computers, they need mobile phones. The very basics of campaigning. And it doesn't cost us a lot to send them that equipment, but having that equipment can really empower them, can really help them fight their campaigns more effectively.
I'm now going to do that really annoying thing where, having said "and finally," I'm then going to say "and finally" again. But we're talking in the context of this. In any other year in Brighton would us be leading up to the biggest weekend in Brighton's calendar with Brighton Pride, which is virtual this year for extremely obvious reasons. But I want to ask you, what does Pride mean to you?
Well, Pride is a celebration of LGBT plus life, culture, and human rights. And I'm all in favor of having a joyous parade. I love a party, but I think we must never forget the LGBT plus battles we still have to fight here in Britain, such as for trans rights, to stop the Home Office from detaining and deporting LGBT plus asylum seekers, to secure an end to the ban on gay conversion therapy, to ensure that every school in the country has LGBT plus lessons to challenge homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, and the bullying that follows. And then, of course, in the wider world, we need to keep up the fight through our Pride parades and events to tell the world there are still 72 countries and jurisdictions that totally prohibit same-sex relations. 44% of them criminalize both male and female homosexuality. More than a dozen explicitly or by implication criminalize trans people. So there are still battles to fight around the world and in the UK. And that, I think, ought to be part of the agenda for every Pride movement and every Pride event. Think about those left behind in this country and abroad. I really object to the sort of often quite vague and flowery themes that prides have mostly. Pride should have a very clear political message. I helped organise this year's 50th anniversary Pride Parade in London on the 27th of June to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Gay Liberation Front in London. This was because, of course, Pride in London was cancelled because of the pandemic. But being a 50th anniversary, I felt it was really important to have a parade to remember the Gay Liberation Front and all the many people in it who pioneered what we have today. They began, there were other movements like the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, which I pay tribute to, but the Gay Liberation Front really was the bomb that ignited the modern movement. And we must remember that. But when we had this parade, it wasn't just a commemoration of the 50th anniversary. We had political demands, like every Pride parade should. So we said, let people define their own gender identity, not doctors or the state. End the Home Office detention and deportation of LGBT plus asylum seekers. Make LGBT plus education mandatory in every school. Things like that. Very simple things. And I think, we need to keep that message. We need to make sure that message gets out. And Pride parades have a huge amount of influence. They get huge media coverage. Why not use that to profile the still unfinished battles here in the UK and around the world?
Thank you, Peter. I just want to give you some a message of thanks actually that's come through from Facebook actually, and I want to say it in their words. They say, "Thank you, Peter, for all your work and campaigning over the years. You have really made a difference." And to have made a difference is a phenomenal thing that not all of us will be able to say when we shuffle off this twig.
Can I just interrupt there? I mean, that's very sweet. It's much appreciated. It's most kind. But yeah, I have made a difference, but so have tens of thousands of others. I wouldn't have made a difference if there wasn't a movement of tens of thousands of LGBT plus people and straight allies. So it's always important to remember that every successful movement, including our own, it is for the sake of the individual, but it only happens because we collectively organize. It's our collective strength that makes it happen. Can I just finish by saying that if anybody's interested, please go to my foundation website, petertatchellfoundation.org. In the top right-hand corner, there's a little button which says join us. Give us your email address, and we will send you a weekly news bulletin about LGBT+ and other human rights issues. It's totally free, there's no charge, but I think you'll find we do some very funny, quirky stories, some very serious ones as well. I think you'll really enjoy it. And I'll just finish with my, finally, with my motto, don't accept the world as it is, dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen. Thank you.
Peter Tatchell, thank you so much for talking to us as part of the Brighton Pride Soapbox in its inaugural year this year, but will hopefully for years to come be a series of lectures and talks, really preserving moments in history. Peter, thank you so much for tonight. And as Peter was saying, if you want to keep up with everything that his foundation does, go to petertatchellfoundation.org. You can connect on Twitter as well, and there are plenty of articles and ways to engage there. Peter, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.